heart-centering moment. I don't remember putting that line in there about running short of beer. I'm pretty sure Jack just put that in there. Uh, so most of you know, but maybe a few of you don't. Before I was a pastor, I was a zookeeper, and I promise I won't reference it every sermon, but occasionally it's applicable. And it's applicable? We've gone through this before. Applicable? It works this morning. We'll go with a more simple word. And I largely worked with birds, even though I did work with some reptiles and some mammals, lemurs and various things like that. But I largely worked with birds. And in the very first place that I was a zookeeper, I worked at two. I worked with a lot of birds of prey, eagles, owls, osprey, all sorts of things like that. And one of the interesting things about birds of prey is that they are designed, their claws, their talons, to grab and not let go. That they almost lock, and it's actually almost challenging for them when they really grasp on something to ungrasp it. And so as you begin working with birds of prey, you get a safety lesson on be careful of the talons, because if they get you, they got you for a while. And one of my coworkers had 4 dots in his thigh where a red-tailed hawk had gotten him, and it had him for about an hour because they grab and they cannot let go. And I got to thinking, how like us is that sometimes? That we just hold on to things, sometimes with a death grip, sometimes, to everyone's detriment, and we just don't like to let go. So I've got teenagers at home, and one in particular, but both of them are at that age where they need some freedom, right? They need to have friends and to go out and do all that. But I've noticed lately that my instinct is to want them home, to want them where I can see them and know that they're safe. Like my daughter went out last night with some friends and ended up spending the night out over at this friend's house. And there was part of me that wanted to call her up and be like, you need to be home. And I realized the reason that she needed to be home was not that that was good for her, because she needs friends. People of that age need their friends. It was because I had this powerful urge and instinct to have everyone here, to hold her really tightly where she's safe and I know she's okay. So the office admin over at Bellevue First has a toddler at home, or young kindergarten age, and he just started kindergarten few weeks ago, and she and I were talking, and she said something like, oh, him heading off to kindergarten, and he has to take the bus, and it's just really hard on him. And I kind of waited, and she said, well, actually, he loves it. It's hard on me. And she was really struggling with him going on the bus and doing something without her. Right? Having his own life experience where mom is not right next to him. And she was struggling with that instinct to grab and to hold. And I think we as humans do that a lot. It's a very natural instinct. We do it with wealth and money. Generally, we do it with points of view. I mean, how often do we actually change our minds once we reach a certain age? It's very rare. We hold graspfully to what we think we know is true or right, whether it be social concepts, political viewpoints, things like that. We just grasp and hold. What are some other things that we grasp and hold on to? Cats. Which good. Possessions. That's right. Things. I remember I had a conversation similar to this with the very first church I pastored in Idaho, and we were in a small group, and we said, okay, if your house was on fire and you had to grab like 3 things, we were playing with the idea of what's most precious to you. What would they be? And one of the people got so flustered because they couldn't decide. They were like, I'll take it all. And I'm like, you can't. Like, what I would. And I'm like, in my imaginary thing here, you can only take 3 things. But she really struggled with what to leave behind. So today, we are going to hear from this, which I believe is close to being a sacred text. It's a children's book called The Quiltmaker's Gift. Has anyone read this? It is, so if the Bible didn't have a back cover and we were still adding to it, there are things that we could probably nominate, like MLK Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. There's other things. I would argue that this could go in. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the story, but I am going to pass it around. So if you want to have a look at it. And for people at home, I'm sorry, but I can't pass it through the magic of technology. But I'm going to tell you about it because it's important. So in this story, there's an unpopular king who wanted lots of things, lots of possessions. And he liked possessions and things so much that he said, I'm going to have a birthday twice a year, not just once. And on my birthday, every person in the kingdom has to bring me a gift. And so this went on for years and years. Every year, twice a year, there were people lining up for miles and miles, bringing the king gifts. And he got all sorts of stuff. He got toys and instruments and telescopes and bicycles and just you name it, and the king had it. He had so much that his castle filled up every room with just possessions of every sort that you can imagine. And yet he wasn't happy. He kept waiting for the right gift that would make him happy. But in that same town, there was an old quilt maker who lived up on a hill, and she made beautiful quilts for those in need. She would make a quilt, and then she would come down the hill, and she would find people who were cold, sleeping on the streets in doorways, and she would wrap them in this beautiful, warm quilt. And so the king got word of this beautiful quilt and these beautiful quilts that were around town. And he was like, why do I not have one of those? I have everything else. Why is this quilt maker not gifted me one of those? And he demanded that she make him a quilt. And she refused. And part of the story there in the middle of the book is the ways he tries to threaten her. And I won't bore you with that, but get the book and you'll go on that adventure with her. But she refused, and eventually she said, I'll make you a deal. For every one of your possessions that you give away, I'll add 1 square to the quilt that I'll make for you. And the king complained about it, but he really wanted this quilt. So he finally said, okay. So he looked around his castle full of stuff, and he finally found one small little present. And he begrudgingly gave it to a kid. And it didn't hurt him too bad. And he thought, well, that's 1 quilt, 1 square of my quilt. And the quilt maker said, well, okay, keep going. So he took some more toys and took them out and found some children and gave them the toys and noticed that made them happy. And he thought, well, that wasn't too bad. And as he was walking around, he noticed that people were going without coats, and it was cold. And so he thought to himself, well, I've got hundreds of coats from all of the gifts over the years. So he went back to his castle, and he got all these coats. Some were blue and yellow and green and fancy, and he took them out into the world and gave it to people who needed coats. And he saw how delighted the people were who needed coats. And he felt even better. And he kind of started to enjoy this, so he got into it. So he organized this big train where he got all of his servants to gather up all of his possessions, and he traveled across his kingdom, and this took many years, giving away his treasures, one by one, to all the people of his kingdom. And while he was doing that, he was happy. He was bringing joy to so many people. And he finally came back to his castle after his many years of wandering all over his kingdom and giving all of this away. And he sat there on his throne, the one thing left, his throne. And he sat there and he was finally content. And as he sat there on his throne, the quilt maker showed up and came and placed the now finished quilt around his shoulders. And in his joy of giving things away, he had actually forgotten about the quilt. And the quilt maker said to the king, "I'm so proud of you. You did as I asked. You became a blessing, and so now on you will be blessed." And she laid that beautiful quilt over his shoulders. But the king smiled and said, "No, I didn't give away everything." And he got up off his throne and helped the old quilt maker to sit upon the throne. Could be a parable, right? There's a deep lesson, as there often is in children's books, about letting go. In fact, I think one of the most important lessons that we can learn as people of faith is to let go. And in fact, all through the Bible, there's this recurring narrative, this recurring theme, almost like, what's it called in music, where there's like a piece of music that comes again and again isn't there a term for that? So it's one of those, whatever the term for that is. That's what's happening here with a motif. There we go. Perfect. I knew between all of us we had one brain that would remember it. Nicely done. But much of the biblical narrative is a story, a tale, an encouragement to let go. The story of Abram and Sarai, who have not yet become Abraham and Sarah, are asked to let go of their homeland and security and all that they know. I mean, the very first word God says to them is kind of, go. Go make that road by walking. Let go of all of this that's familiar. Later in the Bible, we have these disciples. What are they asked to let go of? Everything, right. Jobs, family, a known future, security, their town, safety. What about Paul, the Apostle Paul? What is he asked to let go of? His name, for starters, right? He was Saul, became Paul. What else was he asked to let go of? His hate for the Christians. Right. He was asked to let go of something he thought was true. A way of thinking, a way of believing. Right. The Sadducees and Pharisees, when they were with Jesus, were asked to let go of predeceived notions of what it meant to be holy. And who could be holy? Right? I mean, that's the whole point of the Good Samaritan story. Did you know that for thousands of years in monastic communities, when nuns and monks take their vows, they are asked to give up their names, right? And what else? Their possessions, right? Right. Why? Why is this so important? Why do you think? You know this. If our hands are full, what can we not do? Get something new. Right. There's a video of a young orangutan that I should have pulled up, but I saw them do this when I worked at the zoo. Is when it was feeding time, these young orangutans would come down and there'd be big piles of fruit, and they would try to get all of it. even though there was a troop of like 20 of them, but they would try to get all of it. And they were so desperate to get it all that they kept dropping what they had to get something. Like they just did this. They didn't just take it and go. And we as people struggle with this. I think it's because God seems to understand, and this is all through the Bible, where if we have such a firm grasp on what is, there's no room yet for what might be. And this is kind of the heart of pledge campaigns and stewardship drives, even though we don't talk about it a lot. You know, there is the reality that the light bills have to be paid and stuff like that. But part of the heart of a stewardship campaign is to practice letting go of something that is precious, right? It's a practice of opening up and opening our hands. And all of this today, spending time thinking about letting go, makes me think about us as a congregation, with where we are at and what is likely to come, all the possibilities. And it makes me realize that we need to be thinking not just about what we're getting, right, as the future comes our way, but also what we are willing in faith to let go of. Can you think of any examples of what we might be asked to let go of? Maybe this location somehow, this building or this location. One of the things I've noticed, I've caught myself when I dream about what's to come, is I have a very specific idea in my head of what should be. You could put that in capital letters, what should be. And I suspect each one of us might have something similar when we think about where is this congregation going to be a year or 2 years from now. We all probably have a pretty specific idea of what should be. And I realize that for all of us, myself included, the tighter I cling to that vision that's just mine and mine alone, the more likely it is that that's going to cause a problem. That I think we've got to let go that any one of us knows where we should be and who we should be in a year's time or 2 years. I think one of the great blessings of the pandemic, there's not many, but was that it taught us to let go of the notion that church can only happen in this building, right? We spent almost 2 years being church without hardly stepping foot in a building. That hasn't happened in Christendom very often in the last couple thousand years. And we've gone through that. Hopefully we have learned that we can let go of certain things and church still happens, and maybe it happens in new, wonderful ways. Are there other things we might have to let go of that you can think of? Yeah, Jack?
House.
Pardon?
Home.
Your home. How so? Like,
I can't see you.
right, okay. You actually jumped ahead like 2 lines in this, but I was about to say, over at First Church, and I bet here too, there's people who have lived in homes for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, who have had to let go of that to move to a new place. And I've watched this happen a number of times, and one of the things that's interesting, and actually I think the people who've done this should be our spiritual guides, is they've had to discern, what do you take when you go from a full-size house to a small place? Because you can't take everything. If you did, you couldn't live there, right? Today's text, both of them, but especially the Genesis text, are one of the many promises in our sacred story that tells us that if we are willing to unclench and let go of the things that we hold so tightly, then God will use that space and use us to be a blessing, to do something good in our world, and maybe, if we're lucky, do something great in our world. So back to zookeeping as we finish. Eagles, in particular, osprey do this some too, but eagles in particular frequently drowned because they grab a hold of something that's too big and they can't let go. And as zookeepers, you get calls sometimes where people would say, in the lake, there's an eagle that looks like it's floundering. It can't get up. And you would drive out there, get in a boat, go out, and we lift it out of the water. And every single time, it's latched on to a big old fish that's too big for it, and it refuses to let go. Where would our children be if we can't let them go so they go to preschool or out to experience life and learn? Where would our churches be? Where would we be if the people who came before us didn't come willing to let go of their labor, their time, their talents to build this? Where would we be if Abram and Sarai didn't let go of their comfortable existence in their home nation? Where would we be if the disciples didn't lay down their nets? Come to believe a lot of the life of faith is about our posture towards one another, and posture maybe with our hands as well. And so may God bless us as our hands are open and our hearts are open. And maybe the world be blessed in our doing so. This we pray. Amen.